Hi, welcome back to Lost in Translation, the series where we look at key biblical words that have lost something of their meaning by virtue of their translation from one language to another, one culture to another, one place and time to another, one literary context to another. The word I want to look at today is the word pistis, which we often translate faith or belief. Uh, so first, let's talk about the word itself. Just purely what's lost when you translate this word pistis from the Greek to the English. Well, when we translate it faith or belief, those are good translations. They're not incorrect, but those words are narrower in meaning than the Greek word pistis. The Greek word pistis can connote the idea of mental belief or faith in the sense of mental trust, but it also can just as readily be translated faithfulness. And in many contexts, it needs to be translated faithfulness or fidelity. And the difference between faith, which can be a purely mental act, and faithfulness is that faithfulness connotes not just an act of the mind, it connotes a lived fidelity, a lived loyalty. So, for example, you can use this word in the Greek to speak of a subject's disposition toward a king. And you can say this subject shows pistis towards his king. You're not talking there about pure mental activity. When you say a subject shows pistis, you're not saying he believes in his king or he has trust in his king, although those connotations are included. They're kind of, but you're saying that subject shows faithfulness. He's a loyal subject. That is, he abides by. It's a fidelity that's displayed in behavior. He actually lives out his loyalty toward the subject. You could even say it entails obedience. Now, that brings me to the second point. We've tended in Western Christianity to think of faith as the opposite of obedience, as something that Paul treats as a polarity to obedience, as though stop trying to be obedient. You're never going to be, and instead just have faith, just have trust that God will forgive you. And what I want to say is that's actually kind of a distortion of Paul's thought. If Paul actually saw faith as a polarity with obedience, he wouldn't use expressions like he does in Romans 1 when he describes his whole Gentile mission as bringing about what he calls the obedience of faith. Um, and you can find that in the opening verses of Romans 1. If his big concern was that people were trying to earn their salvation by being obedient, it's odd that he would open Romans by saying, I bring about the obedience of faith. And so that kind of brings me to my second point, and that is we've understood Paul's notion of pistis, faith, and we've put it as the opposite of obedience, primarily because of the Protestant Reformation experience. We've kind of joined Luther in reading into Paul more recent issues, more recent battles. To put it succinctly, Luther's battle was grace versus legalism, grace versus works righteousness, grace versus people trying to be obedient in and of their own capacity in order to save themselves. That's not Paul's battle. Paul's battle was something different, related but different. Paul's battle was a battle of faith versus Torah keeping, or what he calls works of the law. His audience was not tempted like a medieval Christian to try to go earn their salvation, much less purchase it. His audience was tempted to take up Torah keeping. They're Gentiles, they've never been Torah keepers, but his audience is tempted to become circumcised, start and take up the whole ethnic obligations of the Jews on themselves, even though they're not ethnically Jewish. You and I may be tempted to works righteousness or legalism. We've never been tempted in our life, likely, to take up Torah keeping. That's Paul's battle. And one of the big points Paul is going to make is that only one of these paths actually leads to real obedience. Torah keeping gives you knowledge of right and wrong, of sin, and not just the good kind of knowledge, but the bad kind of knowledge, experiential knowledge. But God never intended for it to save. God always intended that salvation would be accomplished in and through Christ, in and through Christ's work. And Paul's point is, one of the major points Paul makes is actually, if you take up Torah keeping, you will never end up being transformed so that you live out a life of obedience. But if you take the path of Christ apart from works, this actually leads to genuine transformation. Your salvation, yes, and your forgiveness, yes, but also real transformation, real deliverance from the power of sin, real obedience, real lived righteousness. Now, I want to be absolutely clear about this. Paul thinks the path of Christ that leads to real obedience is a path of grace. It's purely divinely enabled. And that grace is only found in Christ. But it's a grace it's a grace that doesn't just forgive, it's a grace that actually leads to real obedience. All right, and that brings me to the third point I want to make. And we can kind of see what I was just saying, as well as this third point in a passage I'm going to look at in Romans chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. And that is the occurrence of this word pistis in a phrase that gets translated two different ways in our Bible. The phrase in Greek is pistis Christou, or pistis Christou, faith of Christ, faithfulness of Christ, or faith in Christ. It can be translated both ways. So think about just that difference. You have a phrase in Greek that can be readily translated faith in Christ or faithfulness of Christ. One, faith in Christ, refers to human believing, right? And then the other, faithfulness of Christ, refers to Christ's own faithfulness. And for a number of reasons, scholarship is more and more inclining to that second translation, Christ's own faithfulness. First of all, just the Greek itself, it's more natural to use this particular construction, which I won't describe. It's more natural to use it with reference to Christ's own faithfulness than to speak of faith in Christ. Secondly, when Paul uses the same construction elsewhere in Romans, as he does, for example, with regard to Abraham, it has in view Abraham's own faithfulness, the faith, the pistis Abraham, the faith of Abraham. It does not, and obviously cannot, refer to faith in Abraham. In other words, scholarship is increasingly saying this phrase needs to be translated not faith in Christ, not referring to human faith, but faithfulness of Christ, Christ's own faithfulness. And what Paul is talking about when he speaks of Christ's own faithfulness is his faithfulness unto death. He's talking about the cross event. He's talking about the crucifixion. This is where Christ showed his fidelity, his faithfulness to God unto the point of death. Now, you can see how all this comes together in Romans 3, 21 and 22. Let's read together. I'll start in verse 21. But now, apart from the law, God's righteousness, that's a phrase we talked about in last time's installment. If you want to go back, if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to go back and watch that. There's actually a debate about that phrase, but most translations now translate this God's righteousness. But now, apart from the law, God's righteousness, which is attested by the law and the prophets, has been disclosed or revealed. So God's own world-writing righteousness, his covenant fidelity, has been revealed. Let's keep reading. Namely, God's righteousness revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus. And there's our phrase. God's righteousness revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus for all who believe. And that's the same word, all who have faithfulness. So, if we translate that phrase as faithfulness of Jesus, what we have in view is a progression from God to Christ to all believers. God's righteousness is revealed through Christ's own faithfulness for all who believe, all who have faithfulness. In other words, if we translate it that way, Christ's faithfulness on the cross is the center of history in this sentence. And God is unveiling his world-righting righteousness through Christ's own faithfulness for those who display a similar kind of faithfulness. Those who are one with Christ in his faithfulness is the idea. That's a very different translation than the old NIV used to read. The old NIV used to translate the first phrase in verse 22 as a righteousness from God, as though he was giving a gift, accessible through or received through faith in Christ. So step back. We have here two very different ways of translating this verse. You could be talking about God's world-righting righteousness being unveiled through Christ's faithfulness on the cross. In other words, this is on the stage of history. God is finally following through on his covenant-keeping promises. He's unveiling his world-righting righteousness. And where is he, and by what means is he unveiling his world-righting righteousness? Through the cross, through Christ's faithfulness. Or you can translate these phrases the way the NIV used to. A righteousness from God, accessible through faith in Jesus Christ. There, all that's happening is I'm trusting in God and I'm getting the gift of righteousness. This is similar to what we just talked about in the previous installment. The first translation that we described, which I think is preferable, and which most translations are moving toward, is making Christ's act on the cross, the faithfulness Christ displayed on the cross, the center of history. That is the place where God kind of unveils his good intentions from so long ago. It's where he unveils his own world-righting character, his own world-righting righteousness. The second makes our own believing kind of the center of salvation. God gives a gift of righteousness to those who access it through their own believing. Jesus isn't even the picture, other than he's the object of the belief. Why do I think this matters? I actually think that if we translate this Christ's faithfulness, we're actually making salvation much less about ourselves and much more about what takes place on the cross. I think it also helps us to understand what our own believing, our own faithfulness is. So you'll notice that if we translate this phrase, faithfulness of Jesus Christ, we eliminate a redundancy, right? In the middle of the verse, we're talking about Jesus's faith. And at the end of the verse, we're talking about our faith. But if we translate this phrase, faith in Christ, there's this redundancy. God gives righteousness to those who have faith in Jesus, and he gives it to all who have faith in Jesus. It's a redundancy. So I think clearly that first faithfulness is Jesus's. And what that means is our faithfulness is shaped by Jesus' faithfulness. Our faithfulness conforms to Jesus' faithfulness. And what was Jesus' faithfulness? In Paul's thinking, it was dying. It was dying on the cross. It was a faithfulness unto death. This is what I think Paul means by faithfulness on our behalf as well. He's not talking about pure mental assent. He's talking about what he talks about through all of Romans, which is our being joined to Christ in dying, our being joined to Christ in newness of life, our being joined to Christ in the cross event. We die with Christ, and we're raised to walk in newness of life. And by being one with Christ in his faithfulness unto death, we are joined to the newness of life that he experiences. So faithfulness in Paul is more about cruciformity, about being conformed to the cross, than it is about, purely mental assent apart from any lived fidelity. And to be clear, for Paul, when we are one with Christ in his faithfulness, we're actually changed. We actually live out what he calls in Romans 1, the obedience of faith. And it's purely by grace. I want to stress this. But it is a real obedience, a real lived faithfulness, to translate the word, I think, as it ought to be translated. A real lived fidelity. Why? because something happens on the cross in history. In the cross, the power of sin, which Paul depicts as reigning over all creation, the power of sin is broken. In the cross, God executes sin as a power. So sin no longer reigns in Christ. And for those who are joined to Christ by faith, they are by grace set free from the power of sin, which means we no longer have this master whose name is sin ruling over us. And Paul also talks about this same master indwelling us, and causing us to do the evil that we don't want to do. Paul says in Christ, when we're one with Christ by faith, when we're one with him by faith in dying, when we're one with him in faith in rising to walk in newness of life, when we are joined to him in his faithfulness by our own faithfulness, we're set free from the power of sin, which means we're no longer compelled to do evil. And on the other hand, that indwelling power, that indwelling master that has been expelled, sin, is replaced by a new indwelling power, a new indwelling master, the Spirit, which actually leads us and enables us and empowers us to a life of faithfulness. So Paul's big point is you don't find this in Torah keeping. You don't find deliverance from the power of sin and a new indwelling power within spirit by the path of Torah keeping. You find that in the path of faithfulness. That is the kind of lived fidelity, the kind of lived faithfulness that is possible by virtue of union with Christ in his faithfulness. So go back to Romans 1:17, a passage that we looked at last time. I want to show you how even the thesis of Romans, and everybody agrees Romans 1:16 and 17 is the thesis. I want to show you how this passage reflects Christ's faithfulness as the center of all history and our faithfulness kind of being conformed to that. Verse 17, we talked about this phrase last time, for the righteousness of God, God's own righteousness, his own world-writing character, is revealed in the gospel. And now the Greek literally says, by faith for faith. By faith for faith. And the way the old NIV used to translate that is, they would mistranslate the first phrase, righteousness from God, as opposed to God's own righteousness, is revealed by faith from first to last. By faith from first to last. The way they translate that makes it sound like only one faith is in view. It's nothing. This gift of righteousness is given to those who believe, first to last. End of story. But the Greek actually has two faiths in view. It says by faith for faith. And what's being talked about at the beginning of the verse is not a gift of righteousness, but God's own righteousness, God's own character. So put it all together, and the sentence doesn't say God gives righteousness to whoever believes. Rather, the sentence says God's own righteousness, his own world-writing character, his own world-writing righteousness, his active, saving righteousness, is revealed, unveiled. The word here is apocalyptai. It's kind of the expected end-time unveiling in history. Is unveiled by faith for faith. This is the same phrasing we saw in 3:20 and 3:21, where we had by the faithfulness of Christ for all who believe. These two faiths are Christ's faith and our faith. And the point is, God is unveiling his world-writing righteousness in the cross. The cross is the center of history, not our believing. The cross is the place where God finally discloses how he will keep his ancient covenantal promises at the end of history. Not our believing. Our believing is not the place where that happens. It is for our faithfulness, but Christ's faithfulness is the means by which God unveils that world-writing righteousness. And I think this also makes sense of the Habakkuk quotation that follows. Just as it is written, the righteous one by faith will live. Paul sees that sentence from Habakkuk as a cruciform sentence, referring to the death and resurrection of Christ. The righteous one, Christ, by faithfulness will live. His faithfulness refers to his dying, will live refers to his resurrection. But Paul quotes this because it's not only describing the Christ event as it relates to Christ, it's also describing the Christ event as it relates to us. We also join Christ in faithfulness unto dying. We're one with him in his faithfulness unto death. We die to ourselves, to the old man, to use Paul's language. We do this by faith. We do this through our baptism, by being joined to him in baptism in his death. We do this through communion or Eucharist. We're joined, we share in his death. All of these are ways of talking about how by faith we are one with him in faithfulness, in the cross. And that also means we're one with him in living, in walking in newness of life, to use the language from Romans 6, in resurrection. So for Paul, by faith, for faith refers to Christ's faithfulness and our faithfulness, and this is a cruciform faithfulness. This is not a faith that should be put opposite of obedience. Rather, it's a faithfulness that actually enables obedience. And I'll stop on that note. We'll see you next time.